Continuing our journey on The Rise the Limit, we arrive at Chapter 12, Turning Salt to Sanctuary on Ambergris Cay. After witnessing the collapse of the Loyalist cotton empire that crumbled within a generation due to poor soil and hurricanes, we now follow the story of Horatio Stubbs, born into this failing world in 1810 and educated at Yale to salvage what remained of his family's fortunes. His solution was salt, acquiring Ambergris Cay itself with 6,000 bushels of the white gold in 1826, setting the stage for the island's transformation from extractive industry through decades of abandonment to today's conservation-minded sanctuary, where iguanas eat olives and a son learns to drive on empty roads. Walking the sands of Ambergris Cay, which operates today as a modern thesis on curated luxury, I felt a pull to understand its origins. This curiosity led me away from the sun-drenched beach and into a digital rabbit hole, a quest through the dusty ledgers of the past where I encountered the ghost of Horatio Stubbs. He stood at the center of his family's universe, the third generation of a loyalist dynasty that adhered to the Turks and Caicos like barnacles to a ship of state. The Stubbs clan operated less like a family and more like a 19th-century diversified holding company. Horatio, born in 1810, was groomed for command, while his brothers were deployed strategically to cover the other pillars of society. Richard became a physician to tend the elite's physical ailments, while Alfred became an episcopal priest to manage their spiritual portfolios. It was a brilliant trifecta of influence, one to manage the money, one to mend the body, and one to save the soul, ensuring the Stubbs name was whispered in counting houses, sick rooms, and confessionals alike. To prepare them for this familial manifest destiny, the patriarch Henshaw sent his sons north for a proper education. Horatio and Alfred landed at Yale College, filling their heads with the classics in the cool air of New Haven. This was not necessarily an exercise in intellectual curiosity. It was an investment in the sort of polish that makes power seem effortless. Horatio returned to Grand Turk, the island's hub of commerce, and leaned into his role. He became the scholarly Stubbs, cultivating a grand library filled with books in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, creating a tableau where leather-bound volumes served as props for his authority. For a time, he even kept a school at Grand Turk, an act of civic charity that doubled as excellent personal branding. He returned, however, to a family business facing a colossal agricultural failure. By 1820, the Loyalist cotton boom had withered on the vine, leaving planters staring at barren fields and mounting debts. The Stubbses, first under Henshaw and then Horatio, executed a sharp pivot from the fickle fibers of cotton to the crystalline certainty of salt. Salt became the new currency, the lifeblood of the islands, and Horatio's identity shifted with it. He was now of South Caicos, the center of the trade, a man who would use literal salt to close a deal on an entire cay. It is in these transaction records that the narrative darkens. A local history notes that Horatio quarreled with his father over slavery, suggesting a man wrestling with his conscience. One pictures him, brow furrowed, pacing his library and contemplating the moral stain of the institution that funded his classical education. Yet, when it came time to sign the paperwork, the quarrel appears to have been politely tabled. His 1826 purchase of Ambergris Cay, the very paradise I had just paid handsomely to visit, included an enslaved woman in the transaction as casually as one might include a garden shed. While Horatio nursed his private doubts, his father was busy consolidating. Between 1825 and 1834, Henshaw Stubbs nearly doubled his personal holdings of enslaved people, buying them from less successful planters and cementing the family's position as primary beneficiaries of a brutal system. Horatio Stubbs died in 1886. His life's work, His business ledgers, his personal letters, and perhaps even a record of his moral struggles now sit in a collection in Jamaica, filed under Stubbs family papers. They are the dry, archival remains of a life built on salt and slavery, the foundational elements of a Caribbean sanctuary now enjoyed by people like me. Ambergris Cay, salt, stubs, and shifting sands. The deed for the Cay, however, held a detail that the general biography obscured. A quick calculation of dates revealed that when Horatio Stubbs signed for the property in 1826, he was only 16 years old. While my own adolescence was defined by memorizing video game cheat codes and discovering which household chemicals created a satisfying bang in a bottle, Horatio was busy acquiring islands. It was an act of commercial precocity that makes a teenage lemonade stand look like a failure of ambition, though it is likely the boy was acting as a pen-wielding proxy for his father, Henschel, the true architect of the family's survival. By 1820, the Loyalist cotton fortunes, built on the silty soil of the Caicos, had been devoured by insects and hurricanes. The Stubbs family, reading the wind, pivoted from the failing fibers of cotton to the archipelago's other major commodity. This shift explains the purchase price for Ambergris Cay, which was acquired from a Bermudian merchant not for gold or sterling, but for 6,000 bushels of salt. In the Turks and Caicos, salt was not merely a product, it was the economy, the hard currency against which all other worth was measured. The logistics of this payment are difficult to visualize. A fleet of ships arriving to dump a literal mountain of sodium chloride onto a clerk's desk, a transaction as granular and abrasive as the currency itself. Converted to modern value, the price tag for the island hovered around $76,000. For this sum, the Stubbs family received a dwelling house, the Cay with its scrubby, inhospitable terrain, and the enslaved woman mentioned in the ledger. The deed lays bare the era's brutal arithmetic. She was listed as essential human infrastructure, a piece of equipment required to make the asset viable. Her estimated value sat between £50 and £80, a significant percentage of the total purchase price. Any lingering amusement about teenage moguls encounters a hard stop here, replaced by the stark reality of a woman bundled with a house, her fate tethered to a property transfer between two wealthy families. This was more than a land grab. You could barely grow a decent weed on Ambergris Cay. It was a strategic acquisition. Wealth generated by the old Bermudian salt proprietors was being used to purchase a permanent foothold for the rising Loyalist planter class. The Stubbses were diversifying their portfolio, securing an asset that offered elevations for whaling lookouts and shorelines for scavenging washed-up ambergris. They were converting the very substance their empire was built on, salt, into land. The silken fiber that built and broke fortunes. The purchase of Ambergris Cay for 6,000 bushels of salt was a masterstroke of diversification, but it was also a strategic retreat. Before the Stubbs family became salt barons, they, like nearly every other aspiring landowner in the Caicos, had been seduced by a tyrant in textile form, cotton. This was not standard agricultural stock. It was the famed Sea Island variety known as white gold, a fiber so fine it could supposedly be drawn through a wedding ring. Following the American Revolution, the British Crown had granted vast tracts of local land to defeated Loyalists. By 1788, roughly 40 of these families arrived with some 1,200 enslaved people, intending to replicate the plantation society they had lost in the United States. They surveyed the thin, limestone-based soil and the scorching subtropical sun and concluded, against all botanical logic, that this was the ideal environment for the world's most fastidious crop. It was the agricultural equivalent of raising orchids on a concrete slab. For a brief window, the gamble appeared to pay off. In 1791, the islands produced 260 tons of the fiber, rivaling the output of the Bahamas. Plantations with names like Wade's Green and Cheshire Hall materialized in the bush, and the labor force was organized under the task system. This management style assigned enslaved workers a daily quota of labor. Once completed, their time was theoretically their own. It was a brutal arrangement, yet one that inadvertently allowed the captive population to develop the fishing and farming skills that would eventually sustain them in freedom. The collapse, however, was absolute. The entire enterprise was a house of cards built on a sandbar during hurricane season. First, the biology revolted. The voracious shrubs sucked the meager topsoil dry of nutrients in less than a generation. Next came the insects, specifically the boll weevil, which dismantled the industry with a singular destructive focus. Nature delivered the final blow in 1813, when a massive hurricane flattened the remaining fields and washed away the infrastructure of the boom. Beaten by geology, pests, and weather, the Loyalist planters cut their losses. They abandoned their ruined estates and fled the islands. Crucially, the historical record notes, they often left their slaves behind. This stranded population, the human fallout of a bankrupt business plan, became the foundation of modern Turks and Caicos society. They adopted the surnames of the men who had owned and abandoned them, Stubbs, Bell, Missick, Lightbourne, and forged a new existence from the sea and the scrub. Today, the ruins of those great houses are slowly surrendering to the bush, stone skeletons hiding in the green. The white gold that fueled this colonial fever dream has completed its journey. The cotton is now grown elsewhere, a luxury commodity divorced from the landscape that once broke itself trying to produce it. The islands were left with the wreckage of one economy and a desperate need for another, a cycle of boom and bust that would eventually lead the Stubbs family to convert their salt piles into the remote sanctuary of Ambergris Cay. Ambergris Cay, Wales, riches and redemption. Standing on the sun-blasted limestone of the Cay, I found myself questioning the sanity of the transaction. The 6,000 bushels of salt had purchased a landscape where the soil is thin enough to read a newspaper through and the only irrigation system is wishful thinking. Trying to farm here would be like trying to launch a naval fleet in a bathtub. The trip from Provo still requires 3 hours by motorboat. Under sail, the journey to this patch of scrub must have felt less like a commute and more like a sentence for a crime one couldn't remember committing. When the cotton fortunes evaporated in a cloud of weevils, the island's proprietors did not surrender to the geology. They simply placed a new bet. They turned to sisal, a fibrous plant used for rope and twine. It was the agricultural equivalent of a rebound relationship, a tough, unglamorous plant for a tough, unglamorous rock. An industrial-scale operation rose from the limestone, fueled by the dream of cornering the market on cordage, but global competition crushed the industry by 1919. Today, wild sisal plants still poke from the bush, spiky green reminders of a boom that never arrived. When the earth refused to yield a profit, the settlers looked to the sea. The Cay sits on a migration highway for humpback whales, a geography that inspired both its name and its next industry. Ambergris Cay was christened after the waxy, floating byproduct of the sperm whale, a substance historically used to stabilize perfume. Finding a washed-up lump would not merely pay the bills, it would turn a fisherman into a scented tycoon. By 1846, to capitalize on this marine wealth, locals established a formal lookout station to scan the waves for floating gold. For the residents, however, the whales represented calories rather than cologne. Unconcerned with French perfume houses, the islanders treated the migration as an opportunistic and brutal grocery run. When a spout broke the surface, men rowed out in small boats to confront 40-ton mammals with hand-thrown harpoons. It was a terrifying way to fill a pantry, yet a successful capture brought great rejoicing, a single carcass serving as a godsend that could feed the population of nearby Salt Cay for months. This chapter, too, closed with a thud. By the late 1880s, the local whaling companies were largely defunct, victims of overhunting and geology. The discovery of petroleum in 1859 meant the industrialized world preferred drilling for its oil rather than extracting it from leviathans. The heroic, bloody effort to harvest sea monsters with glorified fishing poles had been rendered obsolete by a hole in the ground in Pennsylvania. Following the collapse of everything, Ambergris Cay was abandoned. For most of the 20th century, it remained a forgotten footnote in the archives of failed Caribbean ventures. This neglect proved to be its salvation. The landscape was accidentally preserved, frozen in time because no one could figure out how to exploit it. The emptiness, the monumental failure to be useful, eventually became its most valuable asset. The whales have returned, promoted from floating saturated fats to the protected stars of an ecotourism economy. The island's value shifted from what could be stripped away to what had been left behind, ending the era of extraction and leaving the stage set for a very different kind of visitor. Betsy's Caribbean ghost ship mystery solved. The island's guest list has not always been so exclusively curated. The arrival of the American brig Betsy on September 4, 1850, for instance, lacked the concierge service to which modern visitors are accustomed. Hailing from Pittston, Maine, the vessel was found stranded on the quay with its cargo of provisions and lumber sitting perfectly composed. The ship itself, however, was devoid of human life. It was the sort of eerie Mary Celeste tableau that suggests the crew had simply popped out for a pack of cigarettes and never returned. The 19th century rumour mill, functioning with the speed of a semaphore and the accuracy of a drunken parrot, immediately went to work. Local speculators decided the Betsy must have wrecked on the Silver Banks, the notorious reef system southeast of the Turks and Caicos that had previously swallowed the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. The prevailing theory held that the brig had become a ghost ship, drifting aimlessly until it beached itself on Ambergris Cay, awaiting a dramatic reveal. The eventual truth was far less theatrical. The mystery was resolved not by a séance, but by the slow trudge of information. The Betsy had capsized during a hurricane back in July off the coast of Hispaniola. The crew had not been abducted by sea monsters. They were rescued by a French bark with the delightfully dandy name Poplar Ferdinand and transported safely to Cap Haitien. Reviewing the historical record, I suppressed a shameful, silent yearning for a more sinister explanation. A kraken, perhaps, or a cursed Aztec coin. Simple meteorological bad luck feels distressingly ordinary for a story with such a spooky setup. Once the adrenaline of the mystery faded, the Grand Turk salvage arbitrators stepped in to handle the disposition of the lumber and provisions with standardized bureaucratic efficiency. This episode highlights the dual role of Ambergris Cay, a refuge for the distressed and a perilous trap during hurricane season. Ambergris Cay, shipwrecks, hurricanes, and survival. The island's geological magnetism for wooden hulls did not dissipate after the Betsy incident. My journey through the archives suggests that Ambergris Cay remained an active participant in maritime mischief well into the 20th century, continuing to humble captains who underestimated its shoals. In 1920, a new vessel decided to test the sands. The ship was named the Giant King. Naming a vessel the Giant King is an act of rhetorical hubris, daring the Atlantic Ocean to prove you wrong. It is the nautical equivalent of naming a hamster Godzilla or a cruise ship the Unsinkable. True to form, the British schooner, a three-masted, 199-ton vessel built earlier that year in Nova Scotia, ran hard aground on Ambergris Cay on December 1, 1920. One might expect a story beginning with such arrogance to end in shards of timber and a somber historical plaque. However, the giant king was evidently made of sterner stuff than its navigation charts suggested. In a twist that avoided the usual maritime tragedy, every passenger and crew member was rescued. Furthermore, the ship itself refused to die. It was salvaged, dragged off the embarrassed beach, and quietly rebranded as the George B. Clouet. There is something wonderfully bureaucratic about renaming a giant king to George. It sounds less like a titan of the deep and more like a mid-level accountant from Connecticut. Under its new, sensible alias, the schooner spent the mid-1930s dutifully hauling supplies for the International Grenfell Association to mission stations, surviving until 1941. It was a rare instance where a shipwreck was merely a rough commute. During this era, Ambergris Cay itself enjoyed a period of solitude. The colonial industries of sisal and whaling had withered away, leaving the island abandoned to the sun and the lizards. It was a deceptive calm, a quiet interlude before the atmosphere decided to rewrite the geography of the archipelago entirely. On September 6, 1928, a storm formed off the west coast of Africa that would become known as the Okeechobee Hurricane. By the time it approached the Turks Islands, it was a Category 5 monster, packing sustained winds of 160 miles per hour. The Weather Bureau in Washington issued warnings, and the local commissioner did what he could to alert the populace, but the physics of the tempest overwhelmed the preparations. This was not merely a storm, it was a meteorological eraser. When the hurricane struck the southern Turks Islands, it did not just batter the coast, it swallowed the land. The storm surge created a tidal wave that entirely submerged Ambergris Cay. The human cost of this inundation was devastating. A group of conch fishermen seeking refuge from the rising winds had anchored their sloop in a creek on the Cay's lee side. This was a standard survival tactic, but a creek offers no shelter when the banks themselves dissolve into the ocean. As the island vanished, their sloop overturned in the churning void. Of the 21 men aboard, only 4 survived. They were sailing a newly built vessel, en route to Grand Turk for registration, when the sea reclaimed the land and exacted its price from those caught in the transaction. Standing on the immaculate sands of the modern resort, where a butler is currently polishing a wine glass with the focus of a diamond cutter, it is difficult to reconcile this luxury with the image of an island completely underwater. I found myself eyeing the high tide mark with a newfound neurotic fixation. The history of the giant king offers a smirk, but the 1928 hurricane offers a warning. I have developed a compulsion to check the elevation of my villa every hour, pacing the shoreline like a possessed surveyor, convinced that if I look away for too long, the Atlantic might decide that George needs another visit. Island echoes, sand, scales, and sky. While the island's history is defined by the brutal economics of sisal and whale oil, my own struggles on Ambergris Cay were decidedly more suburban. I faced the immediate challenge of handing the keys of a golf cart to my pre-teen son for his first driving lesson. He now holds the distinction of learning to operate a motor vehicle on a remote tropical island, a credential that will prove useful only if he ever needs to evade a slow-moving adversary within a gated community. With my paternal liabilities discharged, we continued our survey of the Cay. Along the ridges and beaches, a few divers drifted in the shallows, likely hunting for conch or the newly in-season lobster. They were practicing a milder, recreational form of the resource extraction that attracted the Stubbs family and the whalers centuries before them. We retreated from the heat for the second of the day's 4 mandatory showers, scrubbing off a humidity that felt heavy enough to wear. Clean, or at least temporarily less sticky, we headed for lunch. A large iguana lay sprawled on the walkway, a perfect reptilian model of the food coma I intended to pursue. The mahi tacos were superb, followed by a slice of key lime pie that justified the subsequent trip to the island's fitness center. Perched on a peak with a commanding view of the runway, the gym is an absurdly inspiring place to burn calories, allowing one to watch private jets defy gravity while sweating to move a metal bar 6 inches. Back at our room, we discovered that the local wildlife is not merely decorative, it is expectant. The iguanas here are beggars. We found that while they undoubtedly prefer potato chips, they will mostly accept olives as a marginally healthier option for their delicate cholesterol. This interaction offered a close look at our scaly neighbors. The Turks and Caicos rock iguana, Cyclura carinata, is found nowhere else on Earth. It is the nation's flagship species, a prehistoric relic whose social structure is a complex drama of head bobs and territorial disputes. These lizards were once the kings of the archipelago. Their reign ended not by geological cataclysm, but by the arrival of domestic cats and dogs, whose predatory efficiency wiped the species from every major island. They cling to existence now only on a few predator-free cays like this one, surviving in a fragile bubble of isolation. While the fate of this ancient reptile relies on strict conservation measures, another creature has invaded our lives with far more success. A chicken, a single, fearless, and unaccountably devoted hen has decided that we are her people. She follows us, clucking with the earnest conviction of a cult member who has recognized her messiah. She waits outside our door. She stares us. The island's most iconic native species is a critically endangered reptile requiring boardwalks to protect it. Yet this invasive fowl has appointed herself our personal escort. As we headed out to dinner to watch the sunset, the chicken trailed behind us, a barnyard surrealist amidst the luxury. The dapper dabbler of the salt ponds. Just when I believed we had negotiated a truce with the local wildlife, a peace brokered with the olive-bribed iguanas and the devoted hen, the avian high command opened a new front. The opening salvo displayed breathtaking audacity. A lone gull, executing a maneuver that would make a bombardier proud, performed a precise aerial deployment of a half-eaten fish into the sterile blue of our swimming pool. It floated there, a scaly calling card serving as a grave and unambiguous message. Before we could fully process this provocation, a second mission launched under the cover of our dinner reservation. A squadron of ducks infiltrated the aquatic defenses, enjoying the facilities while leaving behind copious floating evidence of their visit. This brazen violation of pool etiquette demanded intelligence gathering. I had to know the identity of this web-footed insurgency. My investigation identified the primary aggressor as the white-cheeked pintail. This is not the rare West Indian whistling duck, the clandestine operative sought by serious birders, but the duck of the people, the most ubiquitous waterfowl in the Turks and Caicos. It is a striking creature, sporting a crisp white cheek patch that contrasts with a dark cap and a brown spotted body. A distinctive dash of crimson at the base of its bill serves as its regimental flash. Experts classify the species as a dabbling duck, a deceptively charming term for a feeding strategy that involves the bird tipping its entire front half underwater while its rear points skyward. In this undignified posture, it grazes on submerged invertebrates. The maneuver demonstrates the pintail's status as a supreme survivor. It is perfectly at home in any water these islands offer, from fresh rain ponds to the brutally salty man-made salinas that scar Grand Turk and Salt Cay. While the human economy of salt collapsed a century ago, these birds continue to mine the abandoned infrastructure for calories. We are left then with a paradox. We travel to the ends of the earth hoping for a fleeting glimpse of the delicate and the endangered, such as the iguana protected by strict conservation laws. Yet the creature that has most successfully mastered this environment is the one ignoring us in the deep end. The pintail is the true conqueror of the archipelago, ruling its watery kingdoms from the hazards of the golf course to the infinity pools of its temporary human neighbors. From Horatio Stubbs trading salt for his slice of paradise to today's families feeding iguanas and watching sunsets, Ambergris Cay proves that sometimes the best transformations happen when we stop fighting nature and start working with it. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a place evolve from extraction to protection, from hurricane-battered cotton fields to a sanctuary where the biggest decision is whether the iguanas prefer green or black olives. Next time, we're diving deeper into those crystal-clear waters where juvenile damselfish flash their electric blues and invasive lionfish become tomorrow's dinner. Because in the Turks and Caicos, even conservation comes with a side of spiny lobster and a good shipwreck story. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conch and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until next time, keep exploring. This is The Rise the Limit. Continuing our journey on The Rise the Limit, we move from the quiet rhythms of Ambergris Cay's conservation-minded present into Chapter 13, Spots, Spears, Sovereignty in Turks and Caicos. While the previous chapter traced the island's transformation from extractive industries to protected nature, this installment opens with a mysterious carbon fiber vessel washing ashore and expands into the complex web of marine ecology and human choices. From observing a territorial yellowtail damselfish's vivid juvenile spots to confronting the red lionfish invasion that reshaped Caribbean reefs, the narrative weaves together close observation with broader questions of how commerce, regulation, and development continue to shape these island waters. Spots, Spears, Sovereignty in Turks and Caicos, the electric jewels of the coral garden. The duties of a modern explorer are often less about discovery than administration. Following a dinner of local catch, I had scarcely slept before being summoned to the shore to address matters of celestial import. The tide had spat out the carbon fiber sarcophagus I had noted earlier, a remnant of billionaire ambition known as SpaceX debris. Confirmed now as interplanetary flotsam, it demanded management. I located the concierge and surrendered the problem with the gravity of a general handing over battle plans. The resort's engineering corps was tasked with containment, and my stewardship of orbital refuse was concluded. With the beach secured, my son and I proceeded to the day's primary objective, a nautical expedition. The original charter promised a descent to a sunken shipwreck, a prospect holding significant romantic appeal. However, when I informed our guide that my goal was to observe marine life, he nodded sagely and advised that the shipwreck, while famous for being a wreck, was curiously devoid of fish. He proposed a radical shift in strategy. We would abandon the fishless steel for a coral reef where fish actually lived. It was a classic bait and switch, trading rusting iron for sensible coral, but the logic was unassailable. The world beneath the waves opened as a silent theater of darting shapes. Then I saw it. A juvenile damselfish, a creature so intensely blue it looked like a tiny hole had been punched in the fabric of the ocean, revealing a churning electric cosmos behind it. Its body was a canvas of deep indigo spangled with spots of pure light. The sight brought with it a crushing biological reality. This stunning display was temporary, a fish equivalent of a child prodigy destined to fade. As it aged, every brilliant spot would vanish, and its body would dull to the color of wet cardboard. This tiny, feisty sovereign, aggressively defending its personal algae patch like a miniature feudal lord, had no idea its glorious reign was fleeting. I tried to point out this poignant spectacle of transient beauty to my son. He offered a brief acknowledgement before kicking away toward some other distraction. When we later reviewed the digital record, the camera held no proof of the encounter. The moment existed only as an unverified sighting. Those dazzling polka dots are not a fashion statement. They are a finely calibrated piece of social engineering. For a small fish surviving in a neighborhood with the safety rating of a gladiatorial arena, the spots serve as a flag of truce. They broadcast a specific, urgent message to the territorial adults of their own species. I am a child. I pose no threat to your reproductive prospects or your real estate. It is an evolutionary safety vest, trading the risk of eviction for the risk of predation, as the bright colors also advertise one's presence to every passing barracuda. As the damselfish matures and secures its own territory, it sheds this youthful sparkle for a tactical, joyless brown, fading into the shadows to better contemplate its property values. These fish are serious about property. Witnessing one defend its chosen lump of coral is like watching a tiny aquatic homesteader wage war on trespassers. The comparison to human land rights, so fraught in the history of these islands, from the Loyalist plantations to the modern real estate boom, is not merely a cute analogy, it is a direct behavioral parallel. The damselfish claims a resource, invests labor by weeding out undesirable algae to cultivate a preferred crop, and defends the homestead with a fury that would make a cattle baron blush. The urge to fence off a productive chunk of the world is not a legal concept invented by philosophers. It is a basic survival instinct, practiced daily by a 1-ounce fish with a mortgage of blood and sweat. Understanding this transforms snorkeling from passive sightseeing into a kind of forensic biology. The reef ceases to be a static display and resolves into a bustling city of life stories, boundary disputes, and questionable teenage choices. To the beginner, the water contains 2 fish, one bright, one drab. To the observer willing to look closer, it contains a biography. It fell to me to catalogue these quiet dramas as the expedition's chief intelligence officer, all while ensuring my son did not swallow half the Atlantic or drift into the path of a jet ski while I was busy decoding the geopolitics of algae. The beautiful predator that doesn't belong. My surveillance of the reef's feudal struggles was interrupted by the arrival of a creature operating under entirely different rules of engagement. Floating near the coral head was a red lionfish, a vision of such Baroque magnificence that it seemed designed by a committee of 18th-century French aristocrats and drag queens. It drifted with the serene confidence of a pageant winner, trailing feathery fins and bold stripes of white and maroon. Yet this aesthetic perfection masked a heart of unadulterated malice. The lionfish is a piscine femme fatale, methodically murdering the neighborhood. The fish is an invasive species, an accidental export from the Indo-Pacific that has no business in these waters. The prevailing theory suggests the invasion began in the 1980s when home aquariums were dumped off the Florida coast, or perhaps when Hurricane Andrew smashed containment tanks. From that biological breach, they spread across the Caribbean with the speed of a celebrity rumor. They are the perfect predator. They eat constantly, they breed with a fervor that would make a rabbit blush, and they possess no local enemies. The sharks and groupers of the Atlantic view this spiky, flamboyant newcomer with the same deep suspicion a dog reserves for kale. With the reef's natural defenses bypassed, the Turks and Caicos turned to a predator of last resort, the tourist. The islands pioneered a campaign known as Eat 'em to Beat 'em, incentivizing divers to hunt the fish and chefs to cook them. The battle against this invasion is fought not just with spears, but with butter, lemon, and a side of rice. Many restaurants in Grace Bay now feature lionfish on the menu as a gastronomic act of civic duty. Those beautiful flowing fins are loaded with venomous spines that deliver a famously excruciating sting, but the flesh itself is perfectly safe, light, flaky, and similar to snapper. Expert chefs trim the spines with the precision of a bomb disposal technician, transforming a public menace into a main course. To order the lionfish is to validate the market. You consume a delightful meal, support the local economy, and personally participate in the defense of the reef, one filleted enemy at a time. Conch and spiny lobster, reef's raw riches. Xenodociality, the philosophical ideal of being kind to strangers, is a fine principle on land. On the reef, however, it is a fatal flaw. Having absorbed this lesson in Piscine realpolitik from the territorial damselfish, we moved to a more hands-on course, applied predation. First on the curriculum was conch hunting, a pursuit undertaken in water so clear and shallow the boat's hull complained against the sandy bottom. Locating these armored gastropods imparts a primal sense of self-sufficiency, spiced with the thrilling possibility that an improperly handled snail might generously share a flesh-eating bacteria. Camouflage is their primary defense. Their shells are coated in a thick layer of marine grime, appearing as discarded rocks with a grudge. Once the eye adjusts to the deception, they appear everywhere. We amassed a haul of 15 or 20, tossing them into the stern. I am a vocal supporter of the conch, provided it avoids the rubbery purgatory of the deep-fried fritter. The ceviche is its highest calling, with the simple cracked and fried version, a close cousin to calamari, running a respectable second. From the shallows, we motored to a deeper patch of coral. While my son and I snorkeled, our guide conducted his own harvest, returning to the boat with 4 enormous spiny lobsters. He plucked them from their crevices with a simple hook, a technique that seemed far too casual for acquiring the second most important pillar of the national economy. The season had just opened, and these were the first citizens drafted for the table. Unlike their famously armed counterparts in Maine, these spiny lobsters are entirely clawless. All their magnificent sweet meat is packed into a muscular tail designed for rapid, backward escapes. They are named for the sharp, backward-pointing protrusions that cover their bodies like biological barbed wire. Lacking claws, they wield 2 long, formidable antennae, using them less as weapons than as swagger sticks to intimidate predators. As he tossed them into the live well, our guide explained that these nocturnal loners emerge from reef hideouts only at night to forage for snails and crabs. It is a harvest defined by regulation as much as skill. A strictly enforced closed season from April to August ensures this local delicacy remains a renewable resource rather than a historical legend. Reef rhythms: conch, coral, calm. We returned to the dock 30 minutes early, the boat's live well clicking with the restless shifting of spiny lobsters. My wife was still occupied with the final minutes of a massage, leaving her in a state of tranquility the rest of us had yet to achieve. My son, seeking his own form of release, made for a distant water trampoline bobbing on the horizon. His excursion was brief. He returned with a concise trip report. It sucked. The water was thick with jellyfish, he claimed, and while he had avoided a sting, a large specimen had taken a persistent, undulating interest in his legs. Reunited, our small tribe sought lunch. I ordered lamb so volcanically spicy it threatened to strip the enamel from my teeth, served alongside truffle fries that managed for once to balance earthiness with grease. As we ate, we watched a border patrol officer at a nearby table attempting to do the same. On this private cay, customs agents are luxuriantly inefficient resources, flown in specifically to greet coming aircraft, a logistical quirk of high-end isolation. The officer was deep in communion with his meal when the whine of turbine engines cut through the air. A NetJet's flight from Connecticut had begun its descent. The agent sighed, abandoned his plate, and hustled toward the airstrip to validate the passports of the arriving leisure class. The afternoon dissolved into the peculiar, aimless relaxation of resort life. My son attempted a brief, glorious career as a golf cart pilot, but was swiftly disqualified for a flagrant disregard for Newtonian physics. Grounded, he retreated to the pool, where he discovered that the local fauna shared his diet. The island's rock iguanas and feral chickens, mortal enemies in the scrubland, formed a temporary bipartisan alliance to receive his offerings of apple slices. It was a spectacle of interspecies cooperation driven entirely by fructose. While he negotiated treaties with the reptiles, I took a cart to the island's leeward side to search for its most famous non-paying guests, the American flamingos. The birds are a centerpiece of Ambergris Cay's branding as a pristine nature preserve, appearing on websites and brochures as pink splashes against turquoise water. In reality, they are commuters. The Cay does not host a permanent breeding colony. Instead, the flamingos travel along shallow bank routes from the colossal colony on Great Inagua in the Bahamas. They arrive when the tidal flats and interior ponds are calm and rich with brine shrimp, feeding in the salinus before moving on. The resort management treats them as neighbors rather than photo ops, leaving them to filter the water in peace. I checked the flamingo landing holes known to locals, but the flats were empty. Like the guests in the villas, the birds come and go on their own schedule. The evening began with a transition from biological observation to tabletop warfare. A game of Settlers of Catan ended in my defeat when my wife and son formed a vicious coalition, deciding the rulebook was merely a set of gentle suggestions. We declared a truce for dinner against the backdrop of a sunset that bruised the sky purple and gold. Later we lay on the beach, watching the last light drain away. The darkness was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain punctured only by stars and the skittering of iguanas in the brush, rustling reminders that we were merely guests on their rock. We finished the night with the only appropriate response to such vast, quiet, dark, fire, sugar, and chocolate. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 13, Spots, Spears, Sovereignty in Turks and Caicos. What started as a simple morning discovery of a mysterious vessel on the beach expanded into something much larger, a day that wove together the delicate territorial dance of juvenile damselfish, the economic realities of lionfish culling, and the human forces that have shaped these islands through decades of development and regulation. Next time in Chapter 14, we'll explore Ambergris Cay's north side and dig into the island's fascinating attempts at independence, from a failed 1978 bid for quasi-sovereignty to its role in regional drug trafficking, and finally its transformation into an ultra-luxury retreat. The day will end with some unexpected wildlife encounters that bring the island's wilder side into sharp focus. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conch and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until next time, this has been The Rise the Limit.